Hey, my name's Bruce Snell. I'm with BSG International, and today we're talking about Class 7, Applied Business Science, and what we're going to be doing is focusing in on defining your BaseWork Center concept. What you're going to see is that this is really going to be setting the tone for the whole program. As your awareness grows, you're going to understand of how important the BaseWork Center and the base skills are individually throughout the organization that help build that business infrastructure. This class is also going to be closely related to class number 10, that what we call Define the BaseWork Center Startup, actually going in there and start putting these things together. So today we want us to focus on, and we also want to remember and think back about the 4 barriers. Everything that we're doing, we want to make sure that we think about how the 4 barriers to quality are interacting with us of both people and process. As well as we went in and looked at the organization structure, because remember, the organizational structure starts setting up and coming to an agreement on the BaseWork Centers. Then in effect, we start looking at the organizational system, starting to pull those things apart. So here we go. We're looking at define your, if you'll open up your handout to page number 1, and it says, next, you must help your employees develop a better understanding of their individual jobs. You must teach them how to define their jobs. I call this the BaseWork Center. Now, this is what we were talking about as I got started over 11 years ago, is that how in the world are we going to get this complex organization, pull it all apart, and try to develop and break down the systems? This is the thing that we talked about the BaseWork Center. As we got out there, we started seeing people, almost everyone in the organization did different things. So what we're saying is let's get the focus of that job, of that BaseWork Center. Now, I didn't use the term job descriptions. I'm sure a lot of y'all have had job description, and we kind of laugh about it, but it's a good start, is that the job description is usually 2 pages, and it makes sure that you cover everything under the sun known to civilized man. And on the second page, it says, and all other duties assigned. And I want y'all to think about why we're asking that. They never tell you how to do the job. So at the BaseWork Center concept, we're talking about the base, the foundation, the center of your work, what you're focused in on. And then everything outside of that are what we call additional duties. So my theory was when we started, if we get everybody in the organization focusing in their area of expertise and control, is that if we do that, that'll start defining the systems, coming to an agreement by internal customer and supplier, we're going to define those systems. And it did, and it worked. And so if you look at it, that's what we're talking about, the base skills. Because up front here, with this applied business science, everybody goes, well, is that entry level, it's base? No, these are base skills needed by everybody internally within the organization. And if you got an ego problem and can't sit in because it says base, that's a whole nother deal that we'll cover in another workshop. So if you look at it, I go into companies and they go, hey, I don't need this. If you don't need it, this stuff will go that much faster. But we're going to ask everybody to participate, because as we go in there, and if you're not participating, your coworkers are going to hold you accountable, because they're going to understand their process, their step, their procedures, and the terminology. Then in fact, what you're going to do is start digging in. So if you look at the next one down there on the bottom, it says the BaseWork Center concept is the foundation of the program. The system cannot be corrected or improved without first being defined by everyone involved. This is a great statement here, and not that I write great statements, but what we're saying here is that this is the foundation. Remember, we said, who is the best person to tell you how to do the job? The person doing the job. Then who would be logically the best person to tell you how to define it? The person doing it. So then we're saying is that we have to supply them the base skills and the systems and the processes, the program, the direction to hone in on their BaseWork Centers. That's why in a BaseWork Center concept, everybody that touches that particular process, that particular step, that particular procedure, or we're handing off from one BaseWork Center to the other, we have to come to an agreement. That's how we lock down bad quality before we pass it on and our customer is getting it. because we'll come to an agreement of what's acceptable or not acceptable. So once the processes are defined, then what will happen is that when you give me something that's not what we've agreed on, I won't accept it. It won't be a personal issue, it'll be a process issue. And then our goal is that we got to turn around and help that person understand what in the world is that we came and agreed on. Remember, we said the tough decisions. Tough decisions ain't firing somebody. The tough decisions are holding accountable on what we've agreed on. Okay, so this is where we're talking about where it gets down. But instead of management, like I said, Fred, the CEO of Marylight Communications, says that we've taken the devil horns off of management. For in fact, by getting these skills throughout the organization here, instead of management going in and trying to hold everyone accountable and being the bad guy, the employees are holding each other accountable on what they've agreed on. And the only one that gets aggravated with all this mess is the 1%, because they have never been held accountable and they've been manipulating the organization since the start of time. So let's look at page number 2. Page number 2, it says, in order to process the product or service with direction, this is called an order request. Order is from external, request is from our internal customer. Okay, if you look at this, a product or service, everybody here and every organization is producing or supporting some type product or service to support our order request. I don't care if you're in government, I don't care if you're in education, private, nonprofit, or whatever. All of us have something that we're offering, and it's either a product or a service. Everybody from accounting support staff to the folks out there driving, delivering, processing that product is supporting some function to get that product or that service out the door or to support it. So it's very important that we formalize these systems internally within the organization. So in the organization, the base skills, we have to focus in by BaseWork Center. And seeing that's the key. We have to have these base skills, again, for continuance and growth. All right, of these BaseWork Centers, what are some of the things that we really want to be focusing on? We call it the MPSM, and that is we have to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. This is another thing you're going to hear, and believe it or not, when you get sick of hearing it, that's that affirmation setting in. That's meaning you're starting to understand and remember what we're talking about. Because no matter where we're at in the organization or in the program or in the process, you're going to see that all of these things affect one another constantly. So we have to constantly be have them on the forefront of our thoughts, like the 4 barriers. Again, if we have everything known to man basically agreed upon and defined as a procedure, and if we have fear, how good is that procedure? It's not. So these are the things that we're talking about here. To manage is basically the coordination of events and actions, or actions and events of your BaseWork Center to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. We have to plan. How are we going to process the order request? And we're talking about their planning, and that is that we have to look at how we're going to put that deal into play. Remember, we also talked about putting out fires, moving from one sense of urgency to the other, and the whole bit, reactive seat of the pants management. Okay, we're talking about having to plan. Now, I know it hurts you to go into a meeting because we're all so busy to sit, plan, and schedule. Remember, we always have time to do it again at the expense of our employees and our customers. Okay, let's look at the schedule, the scheduling of the order request for the processing. All we're doing here is looking at internally how we're going to schedule to meet the commitments and requirements of that order request for processing. So we're either going to be processing or supporting that thing. The method, how is it going to get done? The skills, the process, or whatever. We need to be developing these base skills internally within the organization at every BaseWork Center. Because again, the larger the organization, the more you need the base skills. Because up here, the management and the leadership trying to lead the organization, and the bigger it is, it just takes a long time for this animal down here to start reacting and moving in a particular direction. And this is why you need all the folks internally within the organization, give them the support, the responsibility, the trust, and the tools to contribute. And let them loose. let them go. Let them get in there and make things happen. Because we also talked about the more entrenched the 4 barriers are, we're saying that the organization starts becoming reactive. And I want y'all to think and be honest with yourself. If you look at, especially if you're in an organization with 500 and over employees, especially when you get into the thousands, is that you look at how much of our time is spent either directly, indirectly in meetings or in project management in there just trying to make sure we don't upset the apple cart instead of focusing in on what that deal is. And the reason we're doing that, because of the 4 barriers. And there's nothing more aggravating to our customers, and then we're trying to figure out where our order is, and we're getting switched from one department to the next, and they have no coordination with the other ones, and we get frustrated. Remember, 67% of our customers leave not because of lower price or competition or anything like that, is that the fact is we did something internally. We did something internally to aggravate them, and they're going, hey, I'm out of here. I'm going to find somebody else to provide me with that product or service. All right, let's look at page number 3, which is our warehouse story. Now, if you look at the warehouse story, it says in one of the companies where we worked, they had 2 warehousemen. In talking to them about their BaseWork Centers, asking for a job description, they appeared to have 2 completely different jobs. Now, this was one of the interesting things when we got started here. And I'll go ahead and read the next one. It says, one of the problems that cropped up to prove to be a good basis for our BaseWork Center component called additional duties. It involved the point at which the truck driver pulled up to have his truck unloaded. Now, this was really kind of the start years ago of our BaseWork Center concept. We had 2 forklift drivers. One thought they were shipping, one thought they were receiving. We had trucks pulling in that needed to be loaded and go, get back out on the road. And what was happening is that the forklift guys were also getting direction from production. Production was saying, pull this stuff out of production and put it away and put it in the inventory. So here's the forklift driver, and the job description said that if the forklift driver is not busy, they need to help the truck driver unload the truck. Can you tell me what happened? Every time the truck driver pulled up, the forklift guy was busy, and then what we discovered is that the truck driver was sitting there saying, hey, that guy don't like me. Every time I pull up, he goes over there and acts like he's busy. And so, this huge friction started. And what we discovered is that, in fact, the warehouse guy was really trying to stay busy and work with the production manager, because indirectly they were kind of his boss also, but they kind of also reported to the dispatch in the warehouse. So in effect, what we're saying is that what is that BaseWork Center? This is really what made us step back and look. We looked at the BaseWork Center of getting that process, step, and procedure for basically receiving and shipping, which is a continual process. Then that's where we developed the additional duties. The additional duties were to pull stuff out of production and put away into inventory, because our BaseWork Center process and step is to unload the truck, put it in the process, load it up, and get it back out. That was our BaseWork Center process and step. Everything else was additional duties. So what happened is that everybody there then understood and knew exactly what the focus of their job was. So in effect, that's where that BaseWork Center concept really came in the focus with those 2 folks in that warehouse, because that was a classic example of, if they didn't get the stuff pulled out of production, they got the tar whipped out of them by the production manager. If they didn't unload the truck, they were getting not only cussed out by the driver, but the dispatch was getting aggravated because their loads were getting out. So these are the things that we want to talk about. That's what we're saying, focusing in on the BaseWork Center. So the warehouse job is really kind of the one that really set the tone. And the life lesson, in an informal organization, the job priority of the day is usually a fire. Now tell me if that ain't true. Has anyone here ever came in and what they were going to do that day, they never did it? Now we're saying here, how expensive do you think that fire is? Because if you look at that fire, because believe it or not, some of us have managed, planned, scheduled, and monitored. So I've got my customers thing in here, moving it through the organization. Now I've got to set it down. And the reason it's a fire because we didn't manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. And most time we don't have the systems, we don't have the training, we don't have the, it goes on and on. That's why we got to start putting this thing to rest in the BaseWork Center and BaseWork Center concept. All right, let's look at page number 4. Now this was an interesting thing. We have a tendency to think business is really so complex because we got a gazillion and one seminars out there telling us how complicated all this mess is, and that's another interesting thing. Y'all ever heard of Generation X? We're sitting there saying that these folks are doing this. Those kids are just as good as any other employee, and they respond to do what's morally and ethically correct, treat everybody as you want to be treated. They're no different. They're just as good a people. We have to treat them with respect and dignity, but that's another thing that came up on how to deal with them. Deal with them with respect and dignity like you do with all your other employees. You're not going to have a problem with them. So if we look at how complex all this stuff is, it's not. But let's just kind of settle down, not beat the tar out of our people, and let's look at the systems and the processes and the data. So let's look at this BaseWork Systems 2000, simply speaking, the workplace. Now we've covered this before, and we're going to cover it again and again. All these things, what we're talking about, that's how we learn. Remember, we learn through doing. Remember the affirmation. We got to repeat it. We got to keep going over it. And like I said, when you get sick and tired of hearing something, you know you've learned it. So that's fine. Okay, let's look at the workplace profile. The workplace profile is basically made up of the following. 1, people. Now, that's not too tough of a concept. It's basically the job, the BaseWork Center. The personalities. Whoa, now this is kind of some tough stuff here. It's basically our qualities of behavior. And we talked about some of those base character issues back in another workshop. The process is the job people are doing. The procedure, how do we do the job? The systems, processes linked together. And then we got to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor all this stuff. Okay, so let's look at that. That's really what the workplace profile is. So everything that we're doing, and then we also want to ask the question, how in the world do these things we talked about interact with the 4 barriers to quality? Now, the reason I keep bringing this back because we want you to understand that we can't just go over here and do the 4 barriers and forget about them. The 4 barriers are present in every issue that we're dealing 98% of the time internally within the organization. Okay, let's look at basically page number 5. It says the BaseWork Center concept. Now what we're going to be doing here is that we're going to start looking at and working through those components of that BaseWork Center. The concept of it, what is it that we're trying to do, and what is the BaseWork Center concept about? Now this is what we're saying. We have to understand this because this is going to define our systems and our organization. This also is going to start forcing up to the top some of these issues that have been laying dormant to the management, but not to the folks down here in regards to accountability, responsibility, who do we report to, the 1% that is affecting the 5%, that's affecting the 20%, all this other stuff. Okay, the BaseWork Center, it says each job has process steps and with the processes linked internally by suppliers and customers who make up the systems. Again, in concept, the job, your BaseWork Center, really all it is that it's a process that I've agreed on with my co-workers in that BaseWork Center, and in those team meetings, that's why we had to figure out how to do the team stuff, is that if you look at, we're coming to an agreement on that focus of that BaseWork Center. My area of expertise and control, that BaseWork Center, which is the process, the steps, and the procedures. So this is what we're talking about here with the BaseWork Center concepts. Now remember, as we're linking these processes, we're now creating the systems in the organization. But what we're doing is that we're getting the people in their area of expertise and control with the base skills, defining those processes, and we're linking them, remember, internal, supplier, and customer. So then as we agree on our process and we hand it off, we have to come to another agreement between that other process or BaseWork Center in that system. Do we agree on what I'm giving them? That's where we're saying we're starting to open up the communication now and get involvement. On the other hand, we're looking at the suppliers, the ones that are doing the same thing. Now they're handing it to us. We have to agree on what we're going to accept or not accept. Because again, we have to agree on what I need in order to do my job. And this is where we stop quality dead in its tracks. We don't accept it if it's not what we've agreed on. Remember the 1%. This is where they start squirming. Because now there's accountability, and there is also not only the accountability, but the responsibility and the corrective action all the way down through the process is that I am not going to accept it. And that's where our employees, 99% of them, love the accountability. They love the responsibility. Because now they can hold accountable all these issues that have been aggravating them all the time. So once we've agreed on it, this is the thing that starts happening. That's why the quality issues start coming up. Because that 1% is going to, like a little child running to his mama when somebody's picking on them or doing something or doing not right. They're going to run, scream, and holler, and they're going to go to their boss. They're going to go to the guy at the top and tell us how bad the organization is and how mean everybody is to them. And what you'll do, we're asking you to step back now with awareness and look if that's not the same person that's always squealing and hollering about what's going on, because the good people are silent. They're not going to say nothing. They're just going to go, this is enough. Pretty soon they're gone, and pretty soon you end up with a bunch of little spoiled brats in the organization that's basically intimidating and pushing around all the informal systems. That's kind of an extreme, but that can easily happen. Let's look at the BaseWork Center development startup. Okay, in the beginning, this is what we were saying, is that we kind of stumbled around a bit, and that was basically that we kind of started brainstorming like everybody else. I told y'all this was like 10 or 11 years ago or something, and everybody was brainstorming. We're writing all those things up on those papers, hanging them all around. And that's where we're saying once we started doing that with that one particular problem that we're brainstorming, is that we created 10 other problems. Then all of a sudden everybody's aggravated and mad. And then I look now on how ridiculous that was. Because number one, we didn't have the skills to even start addressing any issues. And all it was, if we did get something, it was a quick fix. And then what happened is that to look at how we were literally wasting time trying to fix something we haven't even defined. And that's where we're saying we stopped dead in its tracks, and after 8 months, backed up and started focusing on this BaseWork Center concept. So our next question was, how in the world do we start developing this BaseWork Center? Now this is the concept we're talking about. Remember earlier I had told you I looked at this huge big organization with all these systems and all these processes, all these people in the front office, back office, upper office, out on the deck, everywhere. And I'm going, how in the world do we get control or get in a direction to improve and define these systems? Because remember what Dr. Deming said. He goes, 85% of the problems in the organization are due to lack of systems. Systems are the responsibility of management. That was really the only thing I could understand out of most of that stuff, because I'm not necessarily the sharpest guy in town. But what I said is that if Dr. Deming has said that, and he's got 40 years at the time to prove that he's right, I'm going, why don't we just focus in and define the systems first? That's exactly what we did. And the concept was, if we did that, we could at least get a handle on 90 or basically 85% of our problems. That's how it started. So let's look now at the BaseWork Center concept. Let's turn to page number 6. And page number 6 is the summary of forms. Okay, now this was an interesting thing. I told you we tried a gazillion different ways to get out there and get our people to start looking at defining their jobs. And this is where we're saying why we had to go back, start defining the organizational structure, because number one, we didn't even know who we reported to. So what we did is trying to get a handle on what all the things were that we were doing internally within the organization. So the summary of forms is that what we're saying is that we gave a form, a summary of forms, that to collect all the paperwork that I process internally within my organization. Now, what we're not saying is go out and get all this human resource stuff, not unless you're a human resource person, but focus in on that paper and paperwork and data screens, data entry screens, reports, and all those things that you do in the day at your BaseWork Center. Because what we discovered is that the paperwork is going to suggest your systems that you interact with. So now what happens, we start collecting all the forms and paperwork by BaseWork Center. You wouldn't believe how many different interpretations of forms that we have out there. So what we're looking at is that we start collecting the forms, and then we'll talk about this a little later on, but then as we collect the forms by BaseWork Center, we start agreeing on the forms. We start agreeing on the reports, we start agreeing on the processes of those forms, and then we write what we call form procedure. And it's really interesting, as we're learning how to write form procedure, we're also learning how to write what we call process, step, and procedure, which is what a lot of folks out there call flow charting, process mapping, all this other stuff. But we're learning it on something we can understand in a tight compartment, which is a form. We start with how in the world we start filling it out, 1 through whatever. So that's your process, is that form, the steps, and then we write the procedure. So we're starting to learn the skills, because remember what we said, we learn through doing. Define your BaseWork Center worksheet. Okay, as we got in there and we started asking all these people, I said, okay, what is it that we're doing? They're saying that we do everything known to man under the sun, and at times we're doing everything and every day is different. I go, okay. So we develop what we call Define BaseWork Center worksheet, and that is you start listing all the stuff that you're doing internally within the organization daily. And then you collect it and keep it at your desk. And then we're looking at the BaseWork Center packet, starting to define. Now here's an interesting thing here. It says you also need to define the terms for every BaseWork Center. You ask the employees to state their job and what their title is. Now that's kind of interesting here, because when we ask them to state what their job is, half of them don't really know what their job is. And then we ask the employees, what product or service do we provide? And then we ask them, who do they report to? So if you look at that, it sounds very simple, but in effect, it's really kind of tough to start sorting through it, because we're reporting to people daily, and we're asking them kind of literally to list, what is it that you do? What's that product or service that you provide to the organization? So in the BaseWork Center, that's kind of what we call that cover sheet, or that information sheet. So in that, we start really kind of laying it out. What my name is, what my job is, who do I report to, what is the process, or what product or service do I provide for the organization? And it's really interesting. Then we ask them to report or list the 3 top people they report to. And we're not saying the boss, but interact with daily. And the reason we had 3, because almost every one of them we started with, they ended up having 3 or 4 people that they reported to daily, depending on what particular issue or fire that they were messing with. All right, so let's look now at page number 7. And page number 7 is Define BaseWork Center type. If you look at that, there's 2 types under that. One is office management BaseWork Center and non-management. Now, if you look at the office management type, the office management type is literally looking at a series of what we had talked about the other day, kind of work centers. Then that can be accounts payable, accounts receivable, can be answering the phone, processing internal request or order. So they don't necessarily have a process and step yet. What they have is that we're listing these major work centers that they're responsible for. Because remember, when you agree on your base work center process and step, you're held accountable. Regardless, come heck or high water, that has to be done. So that's what's tricky in the office and the management environment, because so many of the things they do have to be done. Whereas in the non-management side of it, it's a process and step. I receive my work, I process it, then I give it to my internal customer. So that up front in the non-management, we really get into that process and step. Everything else is additional duty. All right, with the office and the office management, what we're looking at there is looking at those major work centers and then listing those, because we're held accountable for every one of those. So that's where it kind of gets tricky. Then we just pick the one that they choose as most important. Then we start defining their process and steps. So really what we're doing is trying to sort through all these things that management and the support staff and the office workers are going through. And a lot of times they're intermingling with one another, because they're always either processing or supporting some part of that order request. And if you look at process and steps of your base work center, what we did, again, was to look at defining that process step of your base work center. Process is, what is it I'm doing, the step of that, and defining that procedure. So the process and steps of your base work center. Because remember, once we agree on what it is, now let's define that thing. Okay, out of that, we looked at our additional duties, our base work center additional duties. And our additional duties are daily, weekly, monthly, as needed. So what we're saying again is that base work center process, step, and procedure, we want you to stay focused on that. Come heck or high water, what we don't want you to do is that my additional duty, I'm going to say, is to clean the kitchen up. What we don't want you to do is to clean the kitchen up, and all of a sudden we get orders coming in, there's no one there to take the orders. That's an additional duty. So what we're saying is, let's stay focused in on our base work center. And the reason those things are getting dropped is we haven't agreed on what the focus of that base work center is. So again, the additional duties are everything outside of a part of the base work center. Then we're asking for the requirements, because as we get in, especially to the larger organizations, a little more complex jobs, is that there's going to be requirements that we're going to have to list of what we're going to say is, I guess if we're laying down the part of requirements for hiring somebody. And so that's what we're saying the requirements are, listing those skills that we need in order to do that. Next is that let's look at the table of contents and summary of procedures. As we get into the base work centers, we really do start listing our base work center procedures, and we're listing them by, remember, the base work center, that process and step. Okay, so we're going to be listing our procedures by our base work center, what we call A. B, by our forms. Remember, we talked about our forms a little while ago. So C is additional duties. So you really got three groupings of your procedures. One is by base work center. Remember, your base work center process and step. Then we're looking at the form procedure, and then we're looking at the additional duties. Now, again, the reason everybody in the organization is focusing in on their base work center process and step is because probably our additional duty is somebody else's base work center. So remember, who's the best person to define that job or that base work center? The person doing it. So that's why if we get the whole organization focusing in on their base work center, developing their area of expertise and control, that's how we're going to define the systems by the systems expert internally within the organization. So that's kind of what we're looking at, the table of contents for the summary of forms and procedures. Let's look at page number 9. It's outsourcing based work centers. And I'm going to go ahead and read that life lesson on that thing, because we've talked about outsourcing, and there's some things that you can learn and think about in regards to the 4 barriers and all this base work center stuff, is that an organization has to be socially responsible to its employees, community, and country in both its short and long-term thinking. If an organization is socially responsible and committed to its employees, then it will meet the needs of the community and country. And what we're saying here is that one, is that we know now that outsourcing is a part of life now. Because example, what we're saying there, we were doing some computer cabling, and number one, we're having folks that are assembling or putting the cable together, and we're paying, I think it was $9 an hour. And that at that, we could not compete with 97 cents a day labor in China. So there's some things that we can't do. But my first question is that we're going to outsource it. We need to make sure what we're outsourcing and define that base work center. Because again, a lot of times we get into outsourcing, we're not quoting apples for apples. And I don't care what it is internally within your organization of what you want to outsource, there's always somebody going to beat the price. And in almost every deal that we've had is that when we've outsourced it, within a few years, we look back on it, that price is up as to what we were originally bidded out for, to what we were doing it, and then it starts creeping up. So it's really interesting. We're saying people are going to beat whatever deal you put out there. But also, too, we have to be socially responsible. If we're delegating to and are outsourcing our base work center, because example, one of our companies here pay a lot of money on benefits, health care, and licensing and stuff of the business that they're doing. Well, then we outsource it to somebody that's not paying benefits, that they're not insured, they're not doing right to those people. That's what we're calling social responsibility. Now, what makes that right? It doesn't. Yeah, I might have hit my goals. Remember our quotas, our bonuses, our incentives, and all this? And watch out for that folks that come into your company and all they're doing is sitting down starting to talk about cutting expenses. I'm not saying that we don't have to, because we all got to stay in business, but their only avenue, I'll tell you, save the expense of that person you're bringing in, and just go through anyone in your organization can say, yeah, let's cut 10%, because that's all they're going to do. And then what we got to do is try to figure out how to do the thing. But again, our question is long term, where in the world are we going to be? And that in long term, by cutting expenses or outsourcing, are we improving the way that we're doing business? And also, too, the more we outsource, the more we lose control, not unless we define those base work centers of our quality. That is also involved and in touching, helping those folks that we're outsourcing to. So again, be very careful, and especially if you've got someone that's just coming in there for a couple of years and they're going to turn that bad boy around. Because we have a ton of folks that are out there in the 80s and 90s that were running through here, cutting expenses, selling off divisions, and they basically have gone through and almost ruined I don't know how many companies. But again, those guys got their money, they're gone, they're out of there, and now some of our employees are left without benefits and without pension plans. And all of a sudden now they're outsourced and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do, and they're living off their, what we call life equity. So if you look at all these grand ideas that are coming out, long term, most of them don't work out. We have to stick to the basis, which is our customer and which is our employees. I don't care what anybody says. And remember that thing of leverage buyouts. Oh man, I got so sick of hearing that junk. They're sitting there talking about, yeah, leverage buyouts. Well, what happened was in the 70s and stuff and 80s, we had companies with equity in them. Then what happened, we started leveraging buyout, which is basically highly leveraging the money and junk bonds, and we know what happened to all those boys. Now what happened is that we're taking these junk bonds, we're doing all this leverage buyouts, and what happened, we're eating up, spinning off all those things that we built in these organizations over the years. We've eaten all the equity out of them. So now what has happened, they're saying there's hardly any leverage buyouts. Guess what? We done scraped them to the bone, and now they basically are losing a lot of their integrity. And I'm real curious. Look at some of the older companies that are out there. And I'm curious of what that founder would think of their current business right now based off of the reason they started it. So this is some interesting stuff to think about, the outsourcing of base work centers. Let's look now at page number 10, which page number 10 is talking about employees holding the company hostage. Now, this is an interesting thing that we've talked about here, is that in holding the company hostage, it says the best way to deal with an employee that is holding the company hostage is to remove all the emotion, manage, monitor, and hold them accountable. This employee will process himself out. Now, if y'all remember what we talked about in holding that organization, holding that company, holding that employee hostage, is that usually what we do is that we have the 1% that's affecting the 5%, that it's affecting the 20%, that has now learned to manipulate the informal organizational structure. So in effect, down throughout the organization, they have learned how to manipulate the informal organizational structure. And this is what we're saying, the thing is that's really aggravating our people down through the organization. And the bigger the organization is, there's more places for this person to hide, and the less chances of you at the top knowing what's going on beneath the organization. And what we're saying here, by building the organization's infrastructures, by looking at all the people internally in those BaseWork centers that are defining their BaseWork centers, looking at their process, steps, and procedures, and agreement. Remember what we talked about, the agreement. We look at who do we receive it from, which is our internal supplier, meaning we have to agree on literally what's a quality or not and what we've agreed on. Remember the other thing, we have to hold accountable. That's the tough decisions of what we agreed on. So we don't accept or pass on non-quality. Now I'm processing mine, and now I give it to my internal customer. They're doing the same thing. Are they going to accept? They're only going to accept on what we agreed on. This is what we're saying is where we start holding accountable the 1%, and it's not management, it's their co-workers. Because what happened is that once we start defining what's acceptable or not, and also my BaseWork Center now is, instead of sitting here looking at a personal issue, it is now a process, a tangible issue. And that tangible issue is that we've agreed on what I can accept or not accept, and what's acceptable and what's not, and what's quality and what's not. So now, because that 1% can no longer manipulate that stuff, is now it's being held accountable, and now we're holding that person accountable. They stop holding us hostage, because now instead of dealing with all the hearsay and all the other stuff that's involved, we're now looking at dealing totally with process and systems issues. See, this is what we're talking about here. Now let's step back and look at this holding hostage, because this is really summing up a lot of things. If you look at the part of holding hostage, if by defining those BaseWork centers, those process, those steps, agreeing on what we're accepting and passing on, what's quality, what's not, this is where the quality issues really start happening right here. Because the 1% that affect the 5%, that affect the 20%, that sounds like a good little nursery rhyme thing there, doesn't it? Is that what's going to happen, that accountability is going to come in. That's where we have to hold it accountable. Remember the quality issue. The quality issue is it's in violation of the two rules. Do what's morally and ethically correct and treat everybody as you want to be treated. And it can also be people, process, or procedure, or personality. It doesn't matter. So if you look at this, as we start holding the organization, basically, if you want to say, start holding accountable the 20%, the 15% are going to jump on board. The 1% will funnel themselves out. The 1%, again, in every organization has funneled themselves out because we've never had to fire them because they can no longer manipulate. What's interesting, I really want y'all to step back, especially if you're in a management position, and look at that person that's always telling you what you want to hear. And look at that person that's always coming in and trying to save you and the company and has always got this great idea or this great concept that you're either doing right or doing wrong and somebody else is messing it up. If you look at those bearer of bad news and they're the saviors of the company, I'm asking you to step back again and watch and look. Those people have never been involved. They've never been involved in anything in the organization. So the 1% will now not be able to manipulate the personal stuff or the, I guess, if you want to call the lack of formal or the formalization of the organization, but what they're going to do now is that we're going to focus in on tangible process, tangible procedure. So as we pull this thing through, we're now looking at holding accountable a tangible procedure or process. This is where the 1% is going to come in and they're going to drop out because there's no more wiggle room in here. They can no longer manipulate their boss, their co-workers, or the organization. They become very frustrated, and right around kind of the 8th to 16th month, somewhere in there, they really start squealing, and they're the ones that are going to their team leader, their facilitator, their boss, the guy at the top, and they know exactly when you're going to be at the water cooler because they're going to be there to spread all that gossip. And what they're going to be doing is making sure that you know that they're looking out for your best interest. And so what happens is we formalize that, start holding that thing accountable. What you're going to see is that there's absolutely no room because we're going to be able to turn around and say, okay, what is the process? What is the step? What is the procedure? What is it that... So there's no more gray area. We either did it or we didn't do it, and then if it is a problem, we can address it with a quality issue. I've only had, good night, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 out of all these years of that bad person writing a quality issue, because what you're going to see is that one of the first things when we talk about the quality issue, we feel that the 1% are going to write them on everybody. Remember, they don't even want to get involved, especially if it's in a written form, and that's why we make sure that it's in a written form, is that if you look at it, they're not going to write any of this stuff down, they're not going to do any of those things, and what they're going to do is that they're basically going to withdraw, get back into their hole, and they're going to scream the loudest of why everything that we're doing is defeating the company and hurting our customers and hurting our co-workers and costing the company money. And seeing they know how to do it because they know to go to their manager, because I doubt if any of y'all out there have a budget, right? And probably every year we're trying to cut it 5 or 10% and grow our sales. So if you look at it, they say, oh, if we just got rid of this quality program, Lord, I tell you what would happen. Man, you would start saving money and you'd get your bonus. And they're going, oh, hey, yeah. And all our customers, you know why our customers are leaving? Because we don't have time to take care of them. So they're going to pull every trick out of the hat in order to try to get rid of it. And that's what they've done, and to get rid of all this stuff, of anything positive of what the company is trying to do. Now remember, they're not going to do anything that's constructive for the company or at the benefit, not only of themselves, but of their co-worker or of their organization or of their industry or of any of this other stuff. So if you look at it, holding the company hostage, and this is where those 1% just can't stand it, and this is where we really have to focus in. And I want you to step back as we start developing. This is why the BaseWork Center concept is so important, and I want you as management and co-workers, because see, co-workers, there's that 1% there that's constantly getting you stirred up, and you might be having the greatest day in the world, but what they're doing is getting you so emotionally wound up that you're having a bad day, and that's what they like, because remember, they only move from one tragedy to the next. Okay, now let's look at page 12. Page 12 is frequently asked questions and or thoughts. Okay, now we're going to go over some very basic stuff that you're going to hear BaseWork Center one more time, and that is, what is a BaseWork Center? Okay, that's a good question. A BaseWork Center is, remember, your area of expertise and control, your job, the center of your job, the foundation of your job. A BaseWork Center is the base, the foundation, the center of your job. Everything else out there are additional duties. Remember, so who is the best person to tell you how to do the job? The person doing the job. What's the responsibility of management? Responsibility of management is give the tools to trust or responsibility to define your BaseWork Center. Why are we defining base work centers? By defining the base work center processes, linking them together, we're defining the system. So why are we doing that? We're moving from an informal to a formal organization. And then what we're doing is that we're now starting to hold accountable the organization's systems, or lack of systems. And are additional duties a part of your base work center? Now, it's kind of interesting because this is one of the things that came up. You're saying, Bruce, there are additional duties. Well, the additional duties are daily, weekly, monthly, and as needed. Plus, I told you we got those requirements, which are kind of the requirements of what it takes to get hired at that job. But the additional duties is they're a part of the base work center. But remember, and I'm going to put it kind of clear here, is that the base work center you've agreed on, come heck or high water, that's what you've got to do. And it doesn't suffer at the expense. Remember, we talked about the platinum rule. It doesn't suffer at the expense of an additional duty. Meaning, let's just say I'm a cameraman. And a cameraman, my base work center is probably to operate the camera. An additional duty is to, let's say, I got to sweep the floor. What we don't want is that we have that order, that request in, we're bringing it in, and all of a sudden there's no one there to operate the camera, we're sweeping. And I think that's probably a pretty good example of extremes of base work center, your area of expertise, additional duty is sweeping the floor. Then if we're looking at the floor's never getting swept and it's nasty and that's a daily duty, then we need to back up and look at it again and ask why. How often are we in there? How often are we filming? How often are we operating that camera or that base work center? And is that additional duty, is that a good additional duty for me? Or should that become somebody else's base work center? Do we have somebody else in the organization that's already kind of doing other things? So that was kind of an extreme there, but if you look at it, that gives you a good idea. So the base work center, your focus, additional duties, yeah, it is a part of your base work center, but they don't take precedence over your base work center process and steps. What do you mean breaking the organization up by base work centers? Okay, again, we're saying let's take this huge, big, complex organization, look at how are we going to pull it apart, all these systems. We're saying we're going to pull the systems apart by processes. And usually there's somebody that we're going to assign that process, which is going to be their base work center. Then we're going to look at that process and step of that base work center and procedure. That's why we have to have the base skills to do this throughout the organization. So we're saying by breaking up the organization by base work centers, we're really pulling that organization apart by systems. We're training everybody in their base skills to define their base work centers, which are those processes of those systems. So by tying those things together now, we've created and have defined the systems that we can hold accountable now. We're moving from informal to formal. Okay, here's a pretty neat question here. If the employees have control of defining their jobs, they'll go wild. No, they ain't going to go wild. We actually have some that just get so frustrated, they're going, oh, man, if they're defining their job, telling us what their job's going to be, all they're going to do is be drinking coffee every day and taking 6 or 7 hour lunch breaks, and we're never going to get anything done. And I go, ho, 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 ho. No. Remember, 99% of our people are good people. We've never had, in all these years, anybody go hog wild and going nuts on defining their base work center. Remember, they're going to define that base work center tougher, tighter, more rigid than basically management could ever mandate. So what we're saying is we got to also trust. Now it's tough, especially in the management side of it, when we haven't had systems to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. Remember we talked about last time I let go, I got my hand slapped. So again, what we're saying here, there's a part of that trust. That's where we're talking about consistency promotes truth, that promotes trust. Okay, isn't it, oh, okay, I'm sorry, what is meant by outsourcing a base work center? Basically, outsourcing is we need to define what it is we're outsourcing to the process, the step, and the procedure, because we want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. Isn't it faster just to define the base work centers in a week and move on? Yeah, but you ain't learning nothing. Because I tell you, you already got those processes, and you already got those certification programs out there. You already got these overnight success. We already got these guys that can tell you they're going to make it happier than heck with you within 1 week or 2 weeks or in a quarter and all that. And we already know none of that stuff works. So we're saying here, just like going in and process mapping or going in and looking at where the, I love these audits that they're doing. They're going to come in and do an audit and tell you where you're inefficient. Oh, you need to stack the stuff here, you need to do this. You ain't changed nothing. Yeah, it's helped some, but what you're going to see with no written process or procedure is going to go back just like it was. And so if you look at here, yeah, it might be faster to lay those base work centers down, but your organization ain't learning nothing, and they haven't even stepped one step closer to breaking through the 4 barriers, much less looking at how to treat each other, how to communicate, how to work on the fear, how to write procedure, or how to train. So yeah, it might be easier to do that, and we try to do that already, and we usually try to do that with something that we call job descriptions and move on. So remember, on the base work centers, yeah, we still need to get those people that are doing the job to define them. My job is different. I do something different every day. Ooh, yeah, I hear that about a gamillion times. And so if we're looking at there, that my job's different, but what you'll look at, your process is not different. Your process of managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring, that order request process of how we're doing and what we're processing is going to stay the same, because that's how we collect the data, manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the organization. So if you're looking at it, we're not looking at defining the skill, we're looking at defining the process, because that's going to promote and give that consistency through the base work centers. So, and we'll go more over this in another workshop. If you look at it as we get through this thing here and we start looking at and defining it, is that we're going to really be building the system to allow you to do your job. That's what our job as management is, and of the owners of the organization, CEO, is to give you the systems to do your job, to allow you to do your job. Because remember, 99% want to. So yeah, I've heard that my job is different. I do something every day. Yeah, that. Then we also want to ask, why are you doing something every day that's different? Okay, what is a base work center task team? Okay, later on, and we'll also talk about this in later workshops or later classes and stuff, is that a base work center task team is number one, focusing and coming to an agreement on what a base work center is. Then we're kind of all going through it and putting in our thoughts in regards to what those process steps and procedures are, including the paperwork. And what that's going to do is that those task teams are base work center task teams that have all the same base work centers on the same team agreeing on what we're all doing. So that's a base work center task team. Number 9 is, how do the 4 barriers to quality affect the quality of my base work center? Ooh, we could probably go about 25 days on that. If you look at that, how does it affect? This is really what we're saying that we need to do, y'all, is that we need to look at not only what we're doing, but stepping back and having basically patience and understanding with our co-workers, that not only are we all trying to do our job in our base work center, especially if it's informal, we really want to look at how these base work centers are the 4 barriers to quality are interacting with our base work centers. So we're going to leave you with that thought, and I want you to think about again this base work center concept and why it's so important. Thank you, and see you at our next class.